Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started with this panel. This is part of a larger program today, which you'll hear more about. But we're so thrilled to welcome you to this co-sponsored event by NYU, the Urban Land Institute, and the Waterfront Alliance. I'm Matt Quatnetz. I'm the director of the NYU Urban Lab. And I'd like to introduce my colleague and friend, Felix Champa, to start us off from the Urban Land Institute. Felix?
A little technical difficulty there. Thank you, Matt. Very much appreciate it. I'm the executive director of ULI New York. Thank you, Matt, for coordinating today's panel discussion. I also want to thank Courtney from the Waterfront Alliance for partnering with us, as well as with the Urban Lab for today's event. As Matt mentioned, today's panel discussion is part of a larger event today that is being hosted with the Urban Lab and the Urban Land Institute New York. It's what we call a mini technical assistance panel. I'll talk about that in a second. For those not fully familiar with ULI, ULI is a global nonprofit research and education organization. It is the oldest and largest network of cross-disciplinary land use and real estate experts in the world. And ULI has a mission to shape the future of the built environment for transformative impact in communities around the world. One of the ways ULI and its members do that is through our technical assistance panel program, where they help communities and cities and organizations solve complex land use challenges, like the issue today of coastal resilience on the east side of Manhattan. And so this morning we had volunteer members from ULI interviewing stakeholders. The issues that are being discussed today are issues that many in the community and many organizations have been working through for many years. We recognize a lot of work's already been done in this area. And so we engaged many stakeholders who have been a part of that process and resiliency planning for years this morning, and they were interviewed to get their views. And then later on this afternoon, there'll be a panel that will convene of ULI member experts to think about a vision for a comprehensive kind of redevelopment of the FDR, taking into account the needs of coastal resilience, community access, particularly for communities adjacent to the FDR, low-income communities. There are an enormous number of NYCHA developments and NYCHA residents living along the FDR from top to bottom. So it will be interesting to see what comes out of that. And I just want to thank Matt for organizing this panel and for all the speakers who are taking time out of their schedules today to be with us. Thank you all.
Thank you, Felix. Such a pleasure to be here. Again, my name is Matt. I'm with the NYU Urban Lab. I used to work for NYC EDC, where I worked on a lot of these issues. I'm now thrilled to be doing this first Urban Lab event under what we call the academic veil, where we have the ability to bring together folks on some controversial subjects. But I will say this is our first time doing this kind of event. So if there are some mistakes in how we put it together or people that you think are missing, I hope you let us know. We're always trying to learn. We do think this is an issue that affects quite a large number of people. As you heard from Felix, throughout the day today, we're interfacing with about 20 stakeholders, as well as 10 to 12 technical panelists, and we're getting names of more people whom we should connect with. So if you have some of those names, I hope you'll let us know, and we're happy to reach out to them. Really what's exciting about today is a chance to step back as we get to do with ULI and with NYU. We're stepping back and looking at the FDR. The FDR, it has been around for quite some time. The last time that someone was able to step back and look at it was probably in 1929, looking at the whole length. And so we're trying to zoom out with all of these great folks here to look at what the original plans were and how those relate to all the things that have occurred under Sandy, with the infrastructure bill that's moving through, all of the different plans that have been made from Harlem all the way down to the tip of Manhattan. Felix described what has happened already, so I won't go into that, but I do want to say it really takes a village to put on an event like this, and so I really want to thank Felix and the ULI team, also Chris, who has been working tirelessly all day with ULI, helping to schedule all of this, as well as Vivian, my vice chair on the ULI TAP committee. I also will say Felix and I have had the pleasure to work together, and I've been trained under him in the program committee and then with the ULI TAPs for years at this point. So we're so pleased to be able to partner with NYU and ULI. Inside ULI, we also have champions for this event, which include Vivian, Kate, and Venetia, whom you'll hear more from later. Venetia is our moderator, and also this whole day is really her brainchild. And so excited to support her and the vision that she's put together. Kate has been an integral part of planning. I'm sure she's put in at least 50 to 100 hours on this event. So I just want to acknowledge her and her organization, the Waterfront Alliance. Courtney will be speaking in a second. And also I want to extend my thanks to the ULI panelists. In addition, from NYU, I'm glad to have my dean, Sam Chandon, here supporting this event and the Urban Lab, as well as James, who really put together a lot of this event, Patty, who's supporting us on the Zoom today, and also Maria, who's an NYU research fellow, who probably also put in 50 to 100 hours on this. So thank you so much for that. Later today, after this, we'll be putting together, the technical panelists will be working after this public panel to put together some thoughts. We're hoping to share those with mayoral candidates to get this on the docket for the next mayor to really consider this big project. But today isn't the end. We're going to continue to reach out to people, get them involved, and bird dog these issues. So we really continue, as Felix said, to call for participation from any residents, from advocates, from folks that feel like they have something to say on this topic. We are open and want to integrate your thoughts. Finally, I just want to say before turning this over to Courtney, the opportunity here is pretty large. The FDR, before that, East River Drive has been around for quite some time. It really was a New Deal project that got it started. Now we have the chance for the Green New Deal to take it to the next level. And so we're really excited to have that opportunity here and to hear from some of the panelists about what some of their ideas are for that. So with that, I want to welcome Courtney, one of our co-sponsors at the Waterfront Alliance, to give us a few words on the FDR and today.
Great, thank you, Matt. My name is Courtney Wurl. I'm the president of the Waterfront Alliance, and some of you might know us. We are the advocate for all of the coastline and waterfront that makes up the 5 boroughs of New York City and northern New Jersey. So we're really pleased to be here today. We work to revitalize and make accessible all of the coastline and waterfront in our region. And it's very important also that all communities have access and are protected now in the future from the effects of climate change. So as Matt said, the opportunity is huge to talk about the FDR and what we can have in terms of a new future. And there are a few questions that really excite me about today's presentation and panel discussions. So what is it that we want if we thought of a brand new FDR? And what are the prospects for envisioning a new future for the city and for Lower Manhattan and for the FDR? One of the things, though, we have to pay attention to is that community displacement and the concern that big change will lead to big losses and that new thinking comes at the expense of forgotten communities is something we need to really pay attention to. So we need holistic planning, holistic visioning, and the understanding that things cannot be and should not be the way they were before in terms of how things were planned, how we envisioned, who was involved in those discussions, and how we changed. So really excited. This is a mayoral election year, as we've heard already. Big infrastructure investments will be made in our region. And so we want to have this conversation now as big decisions will be made. So as we're working towards this this election that's coming up, and all of the decisions that will be made over the next 4 years, especially with the new administration in Washington, these conversations are more important than ever. So please make sure that you get involved with us. If you're interested in hearing more, we are holding our conference next week, the Waterfront Conference, May 10, 12, and 14, and a mayoral candidates forum on Friday morning, the 14th. So take your ideas and your questions from today's discussion and bring them to the candidates for mayor next Friday, a week from this Friday. So I want to also thank my colleague Kate Boycourt for all of her hard work. And with that, I'll pass it off to Venetia, who is going to be moderating the panel.
Hey, good morning, excuse me, good afternoon, everyone. So thank you so much, Courtney, for the intro. So my name is Venetia Lannon, and I'm going to be moderating today's panel on behalf of ULI. And we have a couple of slides to begin with, just to orient ourselves. If you want to bring up the first slide. Great. So here are the panelists, and we'll be introducing them all in a moment. But just to begin with, I wanted to just, as I say, sort of orient us. So here is the FDR Drive running down the east side of Manhattan. It starts just south of the RFK or Triborough Bridge, where it meets the Harlem River Drive, and goes all the way down to the Battery, where it meets the Brooklyn Battery or Hugh Carey Tunnel on its way to Brooklyn. It's just shy of 10 miles, about 9.5 miles. I was saying earlier, if you've ever been stuck in traffic on the FDR, which most of us have, and you can't believe it's only 10 miles, but it is. So go to the next slide. So apologies for the blurriness of this this image, but I thought it was interesting. It's right directly from the original New Deal files. It shows the earliest sections of the FDR being built, which are now pushing 90 years old. So this photo is from 1936, showing what was then called the East River Drive under construction from Grand Street to 14th Street. That's the Williamsburg Bridge in the background. We talk about the New Deal, President Roosevelt's New Deal. We forget, it's incredible just how many jobs were created. Over 20 million jobs were created just through the Works Progress Administration, the WPA. That was just one program of the New Deal. And that's the program that built the East River Drive, which is shown under construction here. So we can go on to the next slide. So, really, as Matt was saying, the New Deal is really, quite frankly, baked into the DNA of what we call the FDR. Some basics about the road. Its ownership sometimes is confusing. Parts of it are owned by the city, parts of it are owned by the state. There are joint maintenance obligations for different parts of it. State and city DOT undertake major capital projects. So sometimes, we wonder if the reason the FDR hasn't been thought of holistically is this sort of joint ownership. So the other thing to note is that the FDR was originally the East River Drive was built in pieces. It was built in stretches over the course of the 1930s and the 1940s. And then it was dedicated to Franklin Delano Roosevelt upon his death in 1945. So the FDR has different designs in different sections. Here we're looking at Lower Manhattan, where it's an elevated viaduct. It's 3 lanes in each direction, no commercial traffic. I just learned recently that actually as part of this project that the speed limit on the FDR is 40 miles an hour. That was news to me. But we can go on to the next slide. And here you can see, again, different segments have different treatments. Here it's at grade, port passing Con Edison's facilities at 14th Street. That's Stuyvesant town in the background. Next slide. Up in East Harlem, again, really remarkably close to the river. Those are New York City Housing Authority, public housing developments, NYCHA, as Felix mentioned. There are over 24 different NYCHA developments along the FDR, mostly in East Harlem and the Lower East Side. And as Felix noted, NYCHA residents are an important part of any conversation about the FDR, both today and moving forward. Here on the Upper East Side, the development extends right over the FDR, and the road runs in a cantilever underneath. So there are many different designs that the FDR has depending on where you are, and it's short 10 miles. So you can tell by the vintage of these cars that flooding is a chronic problem on the FDR. And during Hurricane Sandy, these waters actually flooded far inland in many locations, as most of you well know. If you go to the next slide, climate change and sea level rise are only going to make that worse. This is an image from New York City's Flood Mapper website, which I highly recommend if you haven't gone there. So you see the FDR sort of running down the East River on sort of the top of the page here. And you can see the neighborhoods, and we'll zoom in a moment, of East Harlem, the Lower East Side, and Lower Manhattan are very vulnerable. So what does this mean? Let's take a look at the next slide from the Flood Mapper. So what the Flood Mapper allows you to do is look at scenarios under 2050, 2080, 2100. This is East Harlem. The bridge up at the top, if you can see it, is the RFK Triborough Bridge. And what these colors mean, and again, for those of you who aren't familiar, the FDR is running right along the edge of the land there. What these colors mean is the blue is a 100, this is the 2050s. So we selected the 2050s, and in the 2050s, those areas in blue have a 1 in 4 chance of seeing this kind of coastal inundation, a 25% chance of seeing coastal inundation like this. The green is the 500-year storm. Sandy was a 500-year storm. And so when people say with climate change, we're going to see more frequent and more intense storms, it means the odds of seeing this kind of inundation only increase. This is happening. It's just a question of how much more frequently it's going to happen in the future. So let's go to the next slide, and we're almost done with the slides. This is the Lower East Side. That bridge is the Williamsburg Bridge. So we're looking at the East River Park there. The Lower East Side was not so fortunate during Sandy. The tides were timed just right that they actually saw that 500-year damage. And the floodwaters went all the way into Avenue C, a little bit further north of here. So let's go to one last slide, and we'll just look at this is Lower Manhattan, same, this is the South Street Seaport. The bridge there at the top is the Brooklyn Bridge. So, these storms, as I say, pose significant threats to this area, to these areas that we've looked at. So if we can go on, that's the end of the slides. So just to say, just by way of, again, framing, so the city has currently 3 separate studies and projects looking at those 3 areas separately, East Harlem, Lower East Side, and Lower Manhattan. And it's an understatement to say there has been controversy on the proposed coastal protection solution for the Lower East Side, where the city chose not to touch the FDR, and instead they raised the park, and proposing to raise the park, and in both sense of that word instead. And in East Harlem, the city has not shared its preliminary findings with the community. Lower Manhattan, there's a study in the works, but I think it's clear that if you look at that geography that we looked at just now, if you're going to protect the east side of Manhattan holistically, you need to consider the FDR. So the question that's in front of us today is, as Courtney was alluding to, what if we started from the perspective of reimagining and rebuilding the entire length of the FDR, which is something in the time frame of climate change that we're going to have to do anyway. What else could we accomplish? Could it be a model for the Green New Deal creating jobs? Could it reconnect communities to their waterfront and improve air quality and provide open space? Could it accelerate the transition to new technology? Could it accommodate freight and new modes of transit? So these are some of the questions we're going to ask today, and we're so thrilled to have assembled the panelists that you see here on this screen to help us answer some of those questions. So we're going to start with Matthew Washington, who is Deputy Borough President for Manhattan. He's Gail Brewer, the Manhattan Borough President's right hand. I was thinking he's probably her left hand too. The Borough President's office has a really important role in land use approvals, budget, appointing community boards. Matthew actually served as the chair of Community Board 11 in East Harlem. And in general, the BP's office has been a tireless advocate for all of the residents of Manhattan, of course, but in particular, the residents of these neighborhoods as these coastal resiliency plans go forward, and have commissioned an independent analysis on the East Side plan. They've advocated for non-redacted information in Harlem. So I'd like to ask Matthew, I'd like to ask you this question. You have seen, Matthew, firsthand the challenges the city has had in growing, gaining, the trust of local residents in the Lower East Side and East Harlem around decision-making on coastal resiliency. And the independent report that the borough president had commissioned had some great suggestions on basic steps that could be taken to remedy this, like forming a community advisory group and sharing technical documents. But what do you think are lessons learned or best practices from other big infrastructure projects that as this vision moves forward, that we should take to collectively to ensure that the community is appropriately informed, engaged, empowered? What are your thoughts?
Thanks, Venetia. It's great to be here. It's great to see you. Wonderful to be a part of this panel. I don't know how I got chosen for this panel because I look at all the other panelists and I just want to listen to them. And so I think you all just needed an extra guy and I was available. So I'm thrilled to be here.
As always.
Immense thanks to ULI, to the Waterfront Alliance, and certainly to NYU's Urban Lab for allowing me to be here. And, Venetia, I'll jump into that, but I was just struck by the images you showed, of the flood maps. And, up here on my wall, this is actually a framed map of East Harlem. You mentioned I was the chair of the community board in East Harlem, born and raised in East Harlem. My family's lived in East Harlem since the 1940s. And so this map that's framed, it's actually framed with a piece of bubble wrap over the map. And the significance is we need to protect this neighborhood. And so that's on my wall with me every day. And it's a constant reminder in the office that, this is home and this is what we need to protect. And that's why the bubble wrap is there to protect East Harlem. And so, as we think about the importance of that and the maps that you showed, I saw within the boundaries of the blue floodplain, right, which is the 100-year in the 2050s, I saw the building that I grew up in, wow, the building that my mother lives in today, and then the buildings that two of my aunts and one of my uncles lives in today. And so 2050s, my family is in real threat. And so when I think about that, and when I think about this conversation about, the FDR and lessons learned in what we've done, some of the real challenges have been, there's an existential issue where we're dealing with the health and safety of people. And so when we're talking about protecting people's lives, people want to understand what's going on. They want to know what's happening, what's being discussed, what are the thoughts and ideas. And one of the things that we found consistently and unfortunately in our conversations with community groups around Manhattan was just a lack of information and a lack of clarity of why something was being done or what went into making that decision. Mm. And so it's requesting, what were the transportation studies that were done? What have been the flood studies? And so when we, contracted Deltares and Dr. Hans Gerels to, do an analysis of the East River Park plan, the first recommendation was we need greater transparency. We need to make sure that information that is being used to make decisions about how we're planning, shaping, and constructing in communities, it needs to be available to the members of the community so that they can respond to it, so that they can participate in the discussion. And so that became hugely important and something that needs to be done at at a higher level and a more, integrated way than has been happening already. Some of those recommendations are creating community advisory groups, not just sounding boards, but we need to have thoughtful engagement with communities who are actually going to talk about their needs. When we talk about, and certainly I love the parallel of talking about the Green New Deal, and the FDR, since, it was FDR that had the New Deal. And as you talked about, the 20 million jobs that were created, there's opportunities to create, more employment as we think about, the need to protect people from the storms that are coming. And we have to acknowledge that they are coming. And so it's just a matter of when and not if. And so we create job opportunities, we create opportunities to protect families, to protect neighborhoods, and we create opportunities for greater recreation, for better engagement with the waterfront, and to remember that New York City, certainly my friends at the Waterfront Alliance will always remember to let us know, New York City has 520 miles of waterfront. We are a waterfront city. We've forgotten our way, but we need to access it again, and we need to re-engage with the waterfront. And so, the lessons learned are we have to have thoughtful engagement with communities. We can't just have a group of, brilliant minds in a room coming up with plans that haven't engaged members of the community, because there will never be buy-in unless the people who are going to be impacted, my mother, my aunt, my uncle, who are in the 2050, flood plan, they're not going to, sorry, my lights went out. They're not going to, they're not going to buy into some plan that, even from our perspective, an engineer from someplace else came up with a concept but didn't find out, what's happening with the neighborhood. So we have to, the real lesson learned is we've got to talk to the people in the neighborhoods who are going to be directly impacted. And without it, we're never going to have a successful plan.
I think that's absolutely right. And I think, there's a reason why you went first. We couldn't agree with you more, that really, for this whole vision that we're talking about today to go anywhere, it has to start with the local community. Understanding that there are regional benefits that you touched on, it's got to start there. So we really thank you for that perspective. It's awesome. I'm also going to say, housekeeping wise, I forgot to mention, we're going to leave some time for a Q&A at the end. So if you have questions, put them in the chat. We won't be calling on people, obviously. I think we're up to 110 participants, which is great. But please put your questions in the chat and we'll pull some out. Also, I'd like to, wait, is Matt saying something about using the Q&A feature? Hopefully people are seeing that. Also, I'd like to leave some time for panelists, for you to ask questions of each other. I'm sure what each of you are saying is going to be interesting and resonating with each other. So want to leave some time for that. So with that in mind, we're going to move on next to Ali Chowdhury, who is Senior Vice President and Chief of Development and Government Relations at AECOM. For those of you who don't know AECOM, they're a global infrastructure consulting firm. Ali previously was, we worked together I had the great privilege of working with Ali in the Cuomo administration. He was Deputy Secretary for Transportation and Economic Development before that. I want to just start by congratulating AECOM. I understand you guys were ranked #1 by Fortune magazine, again, on the list of the world's most admired companies in your industry for the 7th consecutive year. And if I was going to ask you a question, Ali, it might be, what aren't you building in New York? But AECOM is designing everything from the 2nd Avenue subway to JFK airport redevelopment. And relevant to this project, many segments of the coastal resiliency projects that we referenced around Manhattan. I love that Ali has a background in the governor's office. He's worked very closely with state DOT. And you see what it takes to bring projects to life and to get them done. So you have a unique holistic vantage point. So it would be great if you could tell us more about the work that AECOM has done designing coastal resiliency projects in Manhattan, and what do you see as the benefits of looking at the FDR rather than in segments holistically, both locally and for the region, and not just for resiliency, obviously, but for transportation improvements.
Thanks, Venetia. It's a pleasure to join. Thanks for having me for this timely and very engaging conversation. So real quick, before I dive into the work we're doing specific to the FDR, I figured I'd highlight a couple of things that we've been working on that I think would be beneficial for the audience, for people tuning in particular for hopefully the next mayor of New York City, and as well as borough presidents. Three things I wanted to highlight for folks to maybe think about and look into, hopefully read about. We do an annual Future of Infrastructure report. As you mentioned, AECOM's a big global infrastructure company. There is everything we do. If it's infrastructure, we probably do it in some part of the world, mostly design though. But all the work that we do, first and foremost, has to start with understanding what the community needs. What are the concerns of the community that we're hoping to serve? So we do a survey of about 10,000 folks around the world with some of the biggest cities, from London to Tokyo to obviously New York. And we look for patterns as to demographics, population spread, urban growth, climate change especially, and see what patterns emerge from the concerns of the constituents and the communities that live in these cities. So we publish a report, and that I find to be a very instructive report on what we see happening around the world. And we can learn from those lessons and learn from those practices and true and tried and tested solutions that are helping some of those communities. And I think that's going to be instructive here. Second, another thing I want to point out is we did put out a report in collaboration with the Milken Institute titled Ensuring New York's Future Through Coastal Resilience. Two very well-respected experts at AECOM, Stephen Engblom and Joel Sonkin, both the public and private sector experience, partnered with AECOM, now with VIA, Dan Berkowitz, on looking at how do we finance coastal resiliency projects. I'll come back to that because I think that'll be a part of the conversation, and that's a common thread. The cost of a new deal or the cost of a new Green Deal is something that can be paralyzing for many municipal clients and governments and communities that hope to benefit from it. So that's an interesting report that provides actual financing solutions where the public and the private sector can work together to help these communities be more resilient over the long term. And then finally, I'll come back to where we started, which is Lower Manhattan climate resiliency. AECOM is very fairly embedded in a lot of resiliency work that we're doing for multiple clients and stakeholders, but primarily for the Economic Development Corporation of New York City, which is EDC, and the Mayor's Office of Recovery and Resiliency. You showed the mapper earlier, which I think is not only shocking and informative, but something that we invest a lot of time and effort behind. There is a Lower Manhattan climate resilience study that was released in 2019 with EDC that was primarily led by AECOM through a team of consultants. And that one is available on the EDC website. It's available, all of these things are available on our website, which primarily looks at providing a list of $500 million worth of short-term, near-term projects aimed specifically at resiliency and strengthening infrastructure in these communities that we were able to highlight and pinpoint. And then there's a long-term plan that the study provides with a solution as well as a prescription for a master plan for the entire city of New York with the outer boroughs, which I think would be very instructive for the future government to look at. Specifically for Lower Manhattan, we've done a lot of work, over the course of about 3.5 miles long integrated coastal resiliency and flood mitigation project. Our goal with Lower Manhattan primarily is to look at the devastating effect of especially Superstorm Sandy, as you referenced earlier, sort of like a 100-year natural disaster. They're becoming more frequent, unfortunately. So we've looked at the damage caused. There's about $20 billion worth of economic impact alone to the city of New York coming out of it. So as you can imagine, it's not sustainable. It's not something that we can continue to live with. But there's obviously the human cost of people being displaced, homes being destroyed, businesses being destroyed, and the human toll that takes. So we looked at Lower Manhattan from sort of north of Battery Park to the Two Bridges site, And we worked with the residents to get critical input to shape the project to workshops, focus groups, numerous other engagement activities, as well as confirming a strong desire for more green space, open space, and recreation areas for the community. So one thing that we look at when we look at the resiliency projects is we look to our corporate ESG culture, which is focused primarily on social outcomes of the communities we serve, and especially climate change mitigation. That's something that we as a culture have adopted in all of our design elements across our businesses. And in fact, last week, our CEO announced we hope to be operationally carbon net neutral as a company by the end of this year across the board. We also testified to that in front of Congress as well and provided a list of projects that we think go towards identifying and mitigating climate change hazards. So the Lower Manhattan Resiliency Project has a short-term feasibility study that was done that looked at a sort of a 20, 50, 100-year storm event that you pointed out. So I won't go into that too much. It sort of is the genesis of the mapper to an extent. It looks at modeling of what areas would be impacted and how we can study them and prepare for them. But there's also a long-term study looking at the year 2100. And this primarily identifies co-benefits and opportunities for social resiliency. And we assess different approaches to flood protection, ranging from protecting individual assets as well as to full district-wide protection for a 100-year storm to the year 2100. That work has also been done in partnership with other consultants such as HRNA, BIG, and One Architecture, who we're very proud to partner with. Going sort of south, going to Battery Park along that corridor, we've got a few projects underway now, primarily hoping to achieve risk reduction of coastal surge events in Lower Manhattan, especially in the Battery Park City Authority District, through 2050. And we're coming up with a master plan for flood risk mitigation that involves reconstructing and redesigning Wagner Park, as well as the northern edge of Battery Park City. And we were also recently selected as the owner's representative to oversee a progressive design build development of both the west and the north flood risk mitigation systems in Battery Park City. Finally, and I think particularly interesting for this conversation, we are also preparing a preliminary and a final design for a flood barrier system running close to the water under the elevated run of the FDR between the Brooklyn Bridge and Montgomery Street, which is a couple of blocks north of Manhattan Bridge. And we're doing that now. That work will hopefully be completed by the end of this year, and we're doing that for, again, New York City EDC. So if you think about the map that you showed earlier, you go from Battery Park all the way along the east side near the FDR. We're touching pretty much every node there from a resiliency perspective. However, go back to a point that you made earlier as well, Venetia. This has to be looked at from a holistic approach. I think this sort of highlights the fact that these are all being done in packages and through different avenues, whether it's city funding, whether it's federal funding that makes itself available to the city. So looking at it from a community perspective, this has to be done in a holistic manner, because flooding and storms don't move in the same way that we plan for them. We have to be able to protect all the communities and all the businesses along that corridor as well.
Great.
So
Thanks.
I'll stop there, and obviously happy to talk about more.
Okay, great. I have another question, but we'll move on and we'll come back, because I want to make sure we get to everybody, and then we'll come back. And again, please be thinking about questions you have for other panelists. And I'll correct myself. I think Matt let everyone know, but put your questions in the Q&A. Use the Q&A function, not the chat function. My bad. Thank you. Okay, next we're going to talk to Maritza Silva Farrell, who is the Executive Director of Align, which is the Alliance for Greater New York. And they're a longstanding alliance of labor and community organizations united for a just and sustainable New York. And they've been working at the intersection of economy, environment, and equity before most people even knew that space existed. They also, their vision is that racial justice is an integral part of the fight for economic justice, and it must be paired with environmental justice. So amazing work. And if you don't know Align, get to know Align. They're a great, great organization. But my first question for you, Maritza, is, one of your predecessor organizations, the Urban Agenda, They put out a groundbreaking report, I can't believe it was 17 years ago, called a green collar jobs roadmap that maps how federal and local investments can be better marshaled to create workforce training ladders to emerging green jobs that can benefit the and underemployed. So now that the Green New Deal has finally caught up with you, how do you think a project like what we're discussing here could be structured from the very beginning, not just kind of like some obligation that we have to meet in the construction, but actually structured from the beginning to think about creating jobs, especially for local residents, especially for NYCHA, and also your thoughts about if this could be a climate mindful highway, given your sustainability focus. Big questions, I know, but I'm sure you'll be able to parse it out.
Well, first of all, thank you, Venetia. Always a pleasure, especially just having a space like this, joined by you and my fellow panelists here. Thank you for joining for this amazing conversation. I think it's really important to always find the moments of intersection. And I think when government, private entities, and stakeholders from the communities are coming together, I think we can build great things. I think that's just at least my approach, and that's the approach that Align has been, doing for the past few years. I mean, we became Align actually in 2010 when we merged with Urban Agenda. We used to be known as New York Jobs with Justice. So we learned so much from Urban Agenda, and that report itself really speaks to what we need to speak today, right? How do we come back from any kind of devastation that our cities really are facing? One of the main examples that I can give in terms of the work that we have been doing, just let's go back to the times when Superstorm Sandy hit our city. Right. So the lessons learned from those times are, if we are to pay close attention, can give us a clear indicators of how do we need to just think about the recovery moving forward, even in these current times when we are in, hopefully, getting closer to a post-pandemic time. So I want to refer back to the Alliance for Just Rebuilding, which was a very powerful coalition built right after Superstorm Sandy. This coalition had over 50 organizations from across sectors, from community-based organizations, you have labor unions, you have some private sector businesses engaged in the conversation on what it will take to really get to what we call it Green New Deal, right? And at the end of the day, we have to think about the job creation as a key component. And it's not only about creating jobs. I mean, the thing that we were very careful about during the recovery efforts during Sandy was to think about a creation of good career jobs, not only for the time, but also that can allow for folks to have stability long-term. So we create this thing called the Build It Back program, a program that, the mayor implemented, the Mayor de Blasio implemented in his early years of his administration. And this coalition made that happen, right? So the engagement of groups like labor unions and stakeholders from environmental justice groups, as well as groups in the neighborhoods that were impacted the most, had the opportunity to weigh in terms of like what kind of jobs need to be created and how the rollout of that happened. So one of the things that we did was to ensure that there was a percentage of the jobs that were going to be created to come out from the local community. The number that at that time was agreed upon was at 20%. And working in collaboration with the building unions who have certified pre-apprenticeship and apprenticeship programs really open up the opportunities for folks who traditionally wouldn't be able to access to the direct entry jobs can actually get to those pre-apprenticeship programs, soft skills, and then just get to the skills and later on become a member of the building trades, any kind of affiliate to the building trades. So for us, I think that was the first step, just ensuring that that program really works closely with labor unions who have traditional experience to ensure that people get those career jobs. So that's one way in which we can actually create green jobs. Now that we're moving into the renewable energy economy, that's the way we can actually define just transition, not only the one-time job, right? Now, this is not an easy process. I want to be also very clear that, for that to be successful, we have to think about the ways in which government intervenes, right? What are the source of funding in which government puts forward, right? Whether it's city, state, or federal funding. Nowadays, we are seeing so much of an appetite from the federal administration to really not only say that they believe in climate change, which, by the way, is refreshing after 4 years of having the Trump administration. Is actually really helpful to hear that we have a president who believes that climate change is something that needs to be addressed. And not only that, but looks to invest in the clean energy economy across the board. So we have already commitments for funding that can come from the federal government in a time in which we need to, move into a recovery effort. And then, we have to think also about like how the state allocates those funds. When we worked through the Sandy Build It Back program, one of the things that we did was also track the federal funding that was coming from FEMA, so that the funds will actually get to the communities that were the most impacted. The Rockaways, Coney Island, the Lower East Side, we're talking about the Lower East Side today, and the areas by the FDR, all those communities were heavily impacted through Sandy. So the investment that was given at that time was directly going to create local hiring jobs. Now, what we're hearing from the state is that there is a legislation that they're looking to pass called the community hiring, for example. It will open up the opportunities for those direct entry jobs to happen into these pre-apprenticeship programs, right? And the collaboration, once again, just in case it wasn't so obvious, Align is a big proponent of union labor. And we believe that that's the way in which we can create the career jobs. And collaborating with building unions, I think we'll be able to create those career jobs for the future through the green economy. And also, I would add, in addition to this, lessons learned is that, at this particular time, we are discussing what an equitable recovery it can look like for New York City. And I think the best way to think about this is just really taking a really close look at how the city is investing in our neighborhoods, right? Like how's the budget set up, coming up from the state, from the federal funds, where the funding is gonna be going, for example, for the FDR, right? Like, so we need to redesign and redefine how the jobs will be created there. And I'm not only talking about the jobs to create a bigger highway, but I'm talking about, it's also like what kind of transportation we want to create, right? We have the many environmental justice groups are talking so much about ensuring that EVs, electric vehicles, are at the forefront. And I think we are talking right now in the legislature, just passed a law we're waiting for the governor to sign. By 2035, we're aiming to move to electrification of all vehicles in New York City. That provides an opportunity for the FDR to just be a source of clean, vehicles, and folks can drive through that. And then there's also innovation that happens around this through the ways in which, we have seen EV charging stations. You can create jobs through that. Similarly, if we want to have highways being the ones that charge the vehicles as they're driving, there are some set of pilots that have been created around this that can by itself charge. And I just learned this recently, that in Nevada is something that they are doing, like pilots around this. So we can be innovators, but always thinking about equity and how do we ensure that communities that traditionally have been marginalized of access to those jobs, we actually create those opportunities. And the last point I will say, Venetia, is that after this past year, we all suffer and we all experience the vulnerabilities of our system. And the ones who have been hit the most, as it is with climate change, are the communities of color, the communities who have not been able to access to education, communities who have not been able to access to housing. So it is a time for us to think a little bit, how do we want to rebuild our economy in a way that can ensure that communities that are right by the FDR, you were talking about Harlem, the good Lower East Side, and instead of being gentrified, can actually be uplifted with their voices, right? So we have an opportunity right now to ensure that communities are participants in engaging in how the vision of their neighborhoods should look like, and at the same time, ensure that government and private entities and government and perhaps from the federal and the state weigh in on these efforts. But always thinking through equity and always thinking about the long-term impact rather than the short-term. Let me just check, I did it, create jobs, no matter how bad those jobs might be. I'll close with that. Thank you, Venetia.
Perfect. So inspiring. I love the way you framed all of that. Very, very moving. A tough act to follow. I do also, I want to put a pin in what you said about induction charging. That's the technology where roads, I know Ali, you were talking about this years ago, where the roads themselves actually charge the electric vehicles. That to me is an amazing vision. And maybe folks who know something about that can talk to us about that later. But first of all, it's my privilege now to move on to present, to introduce Vishan Chakrabarti, who I feel like in some ways doesn't need an introduction for many of us. He's a rock star in our world. But for those of you who aren't following Vishan already, he's the William Worcester Dean of the College of Environmental Design at UC Berkeley. And he's also the founder and creative director of the Practice for Architecture and Urbanism, or POW, Manhattan-based firm. Here in New York, many of us are familiar with his work at Shop Architects, where he worked on the master plan and the first buildings for Domino Sugar and Essex Crossing sites, and amongst many others, the master plan for Sunnyside Yards. He, before that, I think is important perspective, ran the Manhattan office for city planning in the Bloomberg administration, collaborating on the High Line, the 7 Line extension, and I believe the East River waterfront from sort of both perspectives, therefore, from the city and from practicing. So I think, it's those multiple perspectives, Vishan, that you bring to this conversation of actually having conceived, planned, and built projects in Manhattan, combined with your knowledge of the East River waterfront from a couple perspectives. I'd just like to ask you, just overall, what your thoughts are about this project that we're discussing, the potential for a holistic look at rebuilding the whole FDR, and how would you approach it?
Sure, thank you. Thanks for having me, Venetia. And it's wonderful to be on this panel with all these great experts. I was so intrigued by the images you showed from, when the FDR was still first built. And I think one of the big lessons we've learned between the 20th and the 21st century is to stop looking at places as blank slates, right? Where you're somehow imagining the city as just this place that you just build stuff. And I think so many of the comments have been obviously about community engagement and doing better forms of community engagement. And that's one way in which we no longer look at places as a blank slate. There are many very important communities, very diverse communities up and down the east side of Manhattan who need to be properly engaged. I think many of the folks who've spoken have already spoken about that. And then two other aspects of that. One is that we are talking about existing vehicular infrastructure. The FDR was built for cars, and I've been part of what's called the war on cars for several years now. And one of the things that I find, especially sitting out here right now in California, which you can tell from the sunshine, is progressive communities are struggling with this issue of cars. Because in progressive communities, they want to blame everything on the Koch brothers and oil companies and so forth. And at the same time, there's an enormous amount of car use in progressive communities. And that is really deeply problematic if we're going to address issues of climate change. Now, there are some aspects of that that are completely legitimate. For instance, how the disabled move around, which is something that I think is deeply important and something that needs to be understood. In Manhattan, that happens primarily through services like Access-a-Ride and other kinds of services, and I think there's a way to address those kinds of concerns. But the right to the car, the right and the right of community groups to argue for the use of the car is something we're all going to have to contend with. Like if you watched on 14th Street and the conversion of 14th Street to a busway bikeway, that people use the Jane Jacobs community revolution tactics to sue the ability to get that busway done. Luckily, it got done anyway, and it is a much better place as a consequence. And so this is going to be a challenge in terms of this, because when I was Manhattan director of planning, there have obviously been plans for decades now about some sort of greenway that loops Manhattan. And on the west side of Manhattan, everyone's familiar with Westway and everything that happened with Westway. And there's sort of a park there, and there's sort of a bike lane there. I mean, it's still, I would argue, far too car dominated and not enough space for people, as that bikeway has actually gotten more and more congested over time. And people for years have looked at the FDR, and the problem is the right-of-way is quite narrow when you have to accommodate the amount of traffic that you have to accommodate. That coupled with one of the key lessons, I think, from the High Line, which is, we can talk about gentrification on the High Line. I know a lot of people have concerns about that. I wanted to talk about a different aspect of it, which is the reuse of existing infrastructure. So, Venetia, when you frame the question, you talk about rebuilding the FDR. And many people have talked about rebuilding the FDR. And my first question would be why? The embodied energy that has gone into that structure, the steel, the concrete, is immense. And I think and again, I'm going back to where I started, which is look at the existing. So existing communities, yes, but let's look at the existing structure and how we can upcycle it before we tear down huge chunks of the FDR and put it in landfill, right? I think there are ways we could think about, so for example, you mentioned that a lot of the FDR is roughly 6 lanes, right? This varies quite a bit depending on its on the location, but imagine if only 2 to 4 lanes, depending on what our borough president can negotiate. Imagine if only 2 to 4 lanes were used for traffic, right? Imagine if only the portion that was inland was used for vehicular traffic and the outboard portion was converted to pedestrian and bicycle use, right? Now, there's going to be a bunch of things. I know there's probably traffic engineers on the panel, and people are going to talk about all the issues with the on and off ramps, and there's a million issues with the on and off ramps, and I don't want to bog down everyone with that level of detail. I'm just trying to get everyone to imagine that that existing structure has ecological value,
that's a good point.
right? And we should think about that. It's also elevated, which helps in terms of this flooding question, and most of it, I mean, there are parts that are not elevated. I had students look at this, and it was very interesting, the kinds of tactics that students came up with. And what's interesting about all of that is when we talk about community engagement, and especially as we get into Upper Manhattan, but across the stretch of it, that territory that the FDR takes up today, there are so many ways, I think, to engage the community to talk about how that territory could be used. For instance, some of my students have looked at, well, could community centers be a part of this? Could, other social infrastructure needs be accommodated? So it's not just a bikeway, busway, or whatever you might conjure, but other social infrastructure needs could also be dealt with. And so, yeah, I just think that before we get into this bad 20th century habit of imagining it from scratch, right? That we should really look very carefully at what's there. Where is it elevated? Where is it not elevated? How does it meet the existing community at different points of grade? So if you have a bikeway, pedestrian way, is it easily accessible from the existing communities, or does it feel like something that sits at a remove and is for other people? And I think those are all things that are very rich conversations for community participation and community collaboration. But I really think in the times we live in, where no matter how much money comes out of Washington, there's limited funds, and there's a desire to kind of just use less, I would really encourage thinking about how to upcycle what's there as opposed to just starting from scratch. That could also help with things like phasing, because I think the odds that we get this all done at once for that 10-mile stretch is incredibly low. And so, and it could also help with things like pilot projects. So for instance, Why not close the FDR to traffic during the weekends and just see how people use it? And so I just think there's a lot of things that can be done that lead up to these conversations, dealing with the existing and really having, I think, an important dialogue with communities about what it means to be less car dependent, which to me is not about switching over to electric cars. Manhattan has 83 lanes of traffic going into it. And the switch over to electric cars will never change the amount of space that cars take up. The fact that in a lot of the United States, we're switching the power from tailpipe emissions to coal pipe emissions. And so I don't think we should be just only looking, I mean, if we're talking about electric buses and other things that move a lot of people, that's great. But I don't think the point of this should be a focus on some technological silver bullet, but rather like, how can we live with what we have in a much more sustainable and resilient way that truly engages the communities that are near this behemoth of a piece of infrastructure?
I love it. I heard that you renamed NYC Not Your Car.
Yes, and I really think that just like Anne Hidalgo is doing in Paris, to great success, unless you talk to a taxi driver or an Uber driver who will swear when they hear her name. I think cities like New York and London and Tokyo cannot afford this amount of space given over to the private car. And I think that, and yes, there are community needs with private cars that we need to think about, but 14th Street proves what New York City could be. And that's, I think, something that is really important as a kind of harbinger of what this could be in terms of the East Side.
Thank you so much. I love think about renaming this upcycle the FDR. I love that concept. I want to leave time for questions. I want to move on to Tyler. Thank you so much. Tyler Duval, not going to talk to us about a technology silver bullet maybe, but hopefully going to talk to us about the future of highways. So Tyler is CEO of Cavnew, and I'll let him explain what that company is to you. But I just want to give you a little bit of perspective on the rest of Tyler's experience. So he's also run a company that operated and maintained a privately operated toll road between Austin and San Antonio. He's been a principal at McKinsey. He was a senior official under President Bush in US DOT. So he actually has public sector experience, private sector experience, and public-private partnership experience. So really interested in your perspective. So Tyler, yeah, if you could talk to us about what is the future of roads from your perspective, and what are CAVs for those of us who don't know what they are, and maybe tell us a little bit about Cavnew and sort of what your company does. Thanks for joining.
Yeah, thanks, Venetia. Great panel, great conversation so far. So, obviously, I think I'll actually just build on what Vishan was just talking about and use slightly different, more consultant terminology, which is the road network around the world, but particularly in the United States, is sub-optimized, right? So we have this massive installed base. We have focused entirely on, physical side of it, with design, construction, and expansion, but it's a massive network that is not functioning efficiently, safely, environmentally friendly ways at all. And, my career, frankly, in transportation at McKinsey at the federal level, and then running a road prior to this, have been very focused on efficiency gains that we can drive through technology, through innovation. I agree with the silver bullet comment as well, but the orientation around our road network is, I think, fundamentally flawed. I was involved heavily in the efforts to do congestion pricing when I was in the federal government with Mayor Bloomberg and his team in New York. I worked for the MTA as a consultant, worked for New Jersey, worked for the state DOT. So I know the New York transportation system quite well and spent many, many days stuck on the FDR like all of us, I'm sure. And I just think it's a basic fundamental problem statement that's not the right one, which is, the current problem statement is how do we effectively deploy capital to modernize and change versus how do we optimize what we have today. And I think Vishan kind of, I think, said that correctly. Our company was formed because we had this massive innovation happening on the vehicle side. So a lot of conversation around electric vehicles, but the big transformation that's coming is the autonomous travel with all kinds of benefits, but also all kinds of risks if we don't deploy them in an efficient and safe way. So our company is the first company in the world to effectively come to market, come to government with a partnership proposition, which is we have an integrated technology solution, hardware on the roadway, software behind the roadway, a digital twin to operate the roadway, to optimize travel, to put more throughput, more efficiently, more environmental benefits, more community benefits, connect communities more efficiently through technology. And that's the idea of the company. The basic problem with autonomous travel, as you're probably reading about in the news, some horrific accidents that have happened recently, the complexity of the operating environment is extremely high. And our CTO, who's a woman who is out of Apple and Waymo and NASA, one of the top robot engineers in the world, designed the Mars rover, she says, this is a complexity problem where the edge cases are infinite. So think about all of the things you encounter on a roadway operation, a child running across the street, a protruding guardrail, signs that are not standardized. The US road network has an infinite number of these problems. So the dream of autonomous travel, the benefits that we can unlock are much further away than I think people expected. Certainly 5 years ago, and definitely 10 years ago. So our company's solution is to simplify the operating environment, put technology on the road to drive this efficiency of mobility that I think we all want, and to use a technology platform that's integrated. So we're not selling you a camera, we're not selling you a software platform. What we're selling you is a solution around travel. And I think the FDR to us is actually a perfect test bed to prove out a little bit of what Vishan was just saying, which is we can have much more effective mobility in a really critical corridor where the city has gotten really disconnected. Obviously in COVID, I was actually looking at Google Maps before I jumped on here to see what the traffic volumes were right now on the FDR, and it looks pretty good. It never looks this good typically, but right now it looks okay. But look, I mean, the city has gotten disconnected. The travel in and around the city has gotten extremely difficult, and we have communities, all across the city that have gotten disconnected from each other. And I think our view is, an optimized FDR, call it, or whatever term you want to use, an effective FDR can really change the outcome for many communities and really reconnect the city in a way that it was intended to be connected. So that's our idea. Obviously, the safety side of our business is front and center. We think there's a huge safety problem. I don't know if folks saw the data last year during COVID. We had a big decline in overall travel demand in the United States and a huge increase in fatalities relatively. So we are not doing well on the safety front. Many thousands of people losing their lives every year in frankly needless ways. And so I think our company is hopefully going to be a partner of government in doing that, bring capital to bear. Alphabet and Ontario Teachers, so a public school teachers fund, and Alphabet have come together to launch this. So quite excited.
And can you, I don't know if you hit it, but what is a CAV, just so people in the audience are aware?
Yeah, so basically connected and autonomous vehicle is what, there's two major trends beyond EVs. That's vehicles talking to each other and talking to infrastructure, and then obviously vehicles operating autonomously themselves. Our company is designed to hit both of those two. And I think when you throw in the EV trend, you're about to see, mobility transformation. Lots of people talking about robo-taxis or form factor transit, where, we have much more innovative ways now to use transit than we've ever had. So, theoretically, autonomous vehicles should be able to drive down some of the operating costs and hopefully enable people who are transportation challenged to move more efficiently.
That's great. And can you tell us more about the project that you're doing in Michigan and the nature of the public-private partnership there?
Yeah, so Yeah, so the first project of its kind in the world is to basically an autonomous vehicle corridor between Detroit and Ann Arbor. So the University of Michigan, the governor of Michigan, the mayor of Detroit all came together, along with the large auto companies. Ford was a big sponsor of this. Their headquarters are right along this route. Have hired Cavenue to design that solution. So it's a 41-mile stretch between the 2 points, with the airport in between. For those of you who've been to Detroit, a major community that's been underserved from transit perspective in Corktown, right outside Detroit and right in the edges of Detroit. And basically our role is to come in and bring this technology platform to Detroit, and frankly, hopefully show the rest of the United States and the world that this is a more efficient way to utilize existing infrastructure.
I look forward to that coming to fruition soon. I understand that's underway. It's exciting.
Yeah, thanks.
I encourage people to Google that. Okay, awesome. Thank you to our panelists. I'm gonna move to some questions that are in the Q&A now. So I'll throw the questions out, and really anyone who wants to answer them, please jump in. I think a lot of these, many of you could answer. So first one I'm going to pick here is about congestion pricing. It says, as congestion pricing gets more likely, with 60th Street being the magic east-west demarcation line, what top impacts north and south of 60th Street planning should be brought into the FDR conversation now? All right, Ali, am I going to have to pick on you?
So I'm going to wear a different hat with a disclaimer that AECOM's not working on congestion pricing in New York City. So put on a different hat. I was very intricately involved on congestion pricing as a policy for the governor, working primarily, with a whole coalition of folks, but obviously the Sam Schwartz vision of what that would look like. I think the demarcation, or whatever you want to put it, whether it's 60th, I think at one point it was 96th. It's moved up and down. I think it's at 60th now. Always involved some apprehension about what we do to the communities in the buffer zone right before the 60th, right? So are people going to be driving down or driving to that sort of buffer zone and park there? So what does that mean? So without getting into the FDR directly, which again, you sort of have to think about how the FDR is exempted out of congestion pricing, right? There's no toll if you're using sort of the outskirts of the island, so to speak, to get into the central business district. That's the current New York City model for congestion pricing. You're only paying the price when you're actually entering the CBD. So you can sort of navigate around. And from what I recall, the policy implications for that were folks being able to get to hospitals and other civic and community centers for what their necessary needs are, without having to pay a hefty toll fine for coming in to the CBD. But yeah, there were all sorts of conversations about on the buffer, about having resident-only parking systems where you'd have to, get your permit. If you don't have that, you can't park there. I think those things are ongoing conversations. I'm not involved, so I can't speak to exactly what's happening there. But there was a lot of conversation as well as study, and there were again multiple reports about it that laid out as to what you would do with the impact of some of the outer crossings. I know the Move New York coalition that Sam Schwartz and his folks had been looking for, and had put together a report on it, showed impacts to some of the other crossings and other bridges, as well as the other, highways, which were not going to get tolled. So I think all of that is available. It's a question of some political, I think negotiations took place at some point as to what would get tolled and what wouldn't, but it was always also up for debate and a review. I believe the legislation at the time had a review board that was going to look at these conversations in dialogue with the community and all stakeholders. Again, I'm not involved, so I can't speak to where that dialogue is now, but one imagines before congestion pricing as a model or as a plan is formalized and finalized, there'll be adequate public comment period and conversation with all stakeholders, not just residents, not just commuters, but obviously also businesses that would get impacted along that corridor.
Great. Does anyone else have thoughts about congestion pricing or pricing schemes in general?
Yeah, I mean, Manish, I'll weigh. I mean, I think, look, there's a big debate, obviously, about pricing generally. I always kind of approach it from a compared to what question, which, I think the equity considerations are very important, but we can also address the equity considerations after the scheme is put in place. I think, generally speaking, we're never going to have a supply and demand balance for transportation without some mechanism to do that. We see that mechanism used extensively in other areas where we want to also protect low-income people. So I think pricing to me is ultimately going to be quite important in the EV world as well, as the cost of, the marginal cost of driving comes down. You're going to see more vehicles on the road. And I think if we don't have some mechanism to balance that, we can reallocate the revenues in lots of different ways based on policy choices and outcomes that we want to achieve. But I think, I spent 15 years trying to help New York do that in many ways. And I think New York should be a pioneer in doing this. And there's a comment made in the chat room. It says no carve outs for congestion pricing. I think the fairest system, I think, is broad-based. And as I said, if it collects more revenue, we can then reallocate the revenue in other ways that we want.
Great.
Just one quick comment on the question on climate. I mean, we also want to reduce emissions in the city, right? So that's another important component in the context of climate change. And the congestion pricing coalition that Ali mentioned, also main focus was to ensure that this congestion pricing policy was set specifically to reduce congestion and obviously carbon emissions, which many cars are producing in the city.
Yeah. Okay, here's another question from the panel, from the audience. I'm a Lower East Side resident that has advocated for decking over the FDR rather than raise East River Park. The deck, as drawn in the Big U initial design, would reduce emissions and extend the park while acting as flood barrier. DDC said it was never studied, and I'm sure there would be other benefits, especially as the FDR is slated to be congestion pricing free zone, adding to the health impacts. Do you think we should stop the East Side Coastal Resiliency now and go back to the drawing board today before the $1 billion plus bid is accepted for ESCR's project area now? How can this be accomplished now? By the way, the local community, especially East River Park Action, has been asking for this since the ESCR plan changed in fall 2018. Warning alert here. I know we've been wading into politically sensitive territory, but we do want to make sure that these questions are aired. That was the purpose of the conversation, not to shy away from these things. Does anybody have any thoughts about any of that question? There's a lot in there.
Well, I just wanted to. Oh, sorry, Matthew. Go ahead, please.
No, please, Vishan.
I mean, I'm just wondering about whether that decking proposal is there, because the assumption is that the number of lanes of traffic are being maintained, and so you need to deck over it, right? And I think that because I think we should look at what's driving that question of why deck, and it's because there's always this. It's amazing, this default that's given over to the private vehicle. And again, someone had a comment in the Q&A about deliveries. There are no trucks on the FDR. It has nothing to do with deliveries. It's primarily private automobile use. Mm-hmm. And so we really need to question that, particularly given that, some of our highest childhood asthma rates are in communities of color in these places that are commutation through zones, mm-hmm. right? And so it's just, that's the issue. So rather than spend a lot of money on a deck, so in order to enable the same amount of traffic throughput, why not really question the traffic throughput?
Matthew, you want to add to that? It's a great point.
Sure. Yeah, I think Vishan's point is really important. Question the throughput of traffic, and it's about reducing traffic. I think, wading into, Phoenicia, you characterize this as politically sensitive. I feel like those are the best things to jump head into and really just talk about it and figure out. Look, I think that it's complex. The idea of stopping right now is, unlikely. I mean, you're sort of clearly, and thanks to East River Park Action and other groups that have been vocal saying we're concerned, have rallied neighbors together and said that we've got to fight for what's right. I mean, we have the we're at a stage where a plan is moving forward. And I think we can all agree that the foundation of what needs to happen is protecting the people from the next storm that's coming. And so how do we ensure that we continue to move forward with the primary goal of protecting people while thinking about infrastructure and how infrastructure helps us think about the future of it, building on what's already there while we do it. So I think it's highly unlikely that the plan would stop at this stage and go somewhere else because the city has found so many, groups that have externally said this is okay. Even the external independent expert who we brought on said that this is a sensible plan that's moving forward. At the same time, the community is frustrated that, they're going to have a demolition of this entire park and we need to rebuild. So look, I don't think we're going to be able to restart, and I'm not sure that restart is necessarily the word that we want to use, because we want to continue to focus on how we protect the people in the neighborhood.
Just one quick thought. We're going to get political, and I give 1 second just to say this. Matthew, I think that's a very critical point. Just listening to the community and what they need is the number one issue. If they change it, if the plans move forward without ensuring that folks are invested and committed to provide feedback from the beginning, then you have to restructure every plan, for any other reasons besides the infrastructure itself. But I do think that the lesson learned here, I think, is that the communities have to be engaged at the front end of any project or proposal.
Yeah, agreed. One more question here.
Venetia, can I add one quick?
Yeah, absolutely.
Venetia, can I add one? Just add to it. I agree absolutely with the comment about community engagement. I think also maybe one way to think about some of the ideas about decking, for example, is about community concessions too. Sometimes with community engagement, you need to be able to give certain social outcomes and benefits to the community, although from a design perspective or from a scope perspective, it may not be exactly in line with what you set out to do, but you realize that you have an opportunity and it doesn't come around every day. We're talking about a project completed, almost 100 years ago. When you get those opportunities, it's sometimes important to look at the holistic picture from a bird's eye view and say, what else can we do for the community, sort of piggyback off this project and put some benefit out on the street for the community and the residents that live there. So I think sometimes that's why decking conversations come up, because people think about, I want access to a waterfront that I've never had before because they put this big giant mammoth structure in front, right? And that happens in a lot of places. We've talked obviously a lot about waterfront, reclamation projects, whether it's viaducts or the inner loop in Rochester, ID1, a lot of different projects that split communities and cut people off from their waterfront in their own communities. I think there has been a movement in the last 10, 15 years or so to go back and revisit those. It's not always possible in every situation, but I think even where it isn't, there could be opportunities for the community to feel somewhat connected to their own natural resource and their own scenic view on the waterfront for themselves and their families. And I think there's a way to do it. It just requires stakeholders to be able to coordinate from the actual technical sort of engineering construction purpose of what you're hoping to achieve, with also the benefits and the desires of the community that lives adjacent to that structure.
Okay, last question. Says after Sandy, the city analyzed resiliency needs in Lower Manhattan and all over NYC via the SIRR. And for those of you who don't know, that's the Special Initiative on Resiliency and Rebuilding. Lots of studies and analyses were done and proposals for what needed to be done throughout all of NYC. Have any of these projects been completed in the last 10 years, or did their prioritization disappear with the Bloomberg administration? No offense here, Ali. Why is AECOM still advising EDC on what needs to be done if that report should have done the same thing?
I think it's a fair question, but no offense to the person asking the question, it confuses a few different reports, and they are confusing. So to be fair and sympathetic to the person asking the question, this sort of work does happen routinely, and I probably more than anybody else share in the frustration when things don't happen. I think we all sort of come from the place of getting things done. I think what happens primarily, to be honest, is it's a funding issue. You look at these reports and these studies or these viability sort of studies that come out, we know what needs to happen. I don't think it's uniquely a New York problem. It's an American problem with infrastructure, and it's been with us for a while now. We actually know what needs to happen. That is not a secret. The problem is getting the stakeholders to invest in it, because with finite resources, everybody's competing to get their priorities fulfilled and realize infrastructure tends to be very expensive. So one project alone can take $10 billion, for example. I think that's one of the studies that we worked on, sort of a master plan for the East River shoreline. I think that's the number they came back with, right? That's a huge amount. I mean, with the Bond Act that just got sort of revitalized at the state level, that's $3 billion. But I remember the initial conversation was 10 billion, and it eventually got done at 3. So I think resource allocation is a huge issue behind infrastructure and resiliency projects themselves as well. That's why I believe it's a conversation we haven't had here yet, but I think a crucial conversation for the next mayor of New York City and all of our borough presidents is about financing. How are we going to open sort of, to have this outside the box thinking around public and private financing to make these projects real again and realizable. And I think that's something that we're all struggling with across the board, across the US, but I think it's particularly true for New York, where construction and projects are particularly expensive.
Yeah, and I'll just jump in too on that question that, many of those projects did move forward past the Bloomberg administration into the de Blasio administration. I don't know the exact number, but I would say easily a majority of them continue to move forward. And the sort of seeds of what we're talking about here were planted in that, in that report in many ways. So it's a good question. I want to leave Can
I just say one thing, Benicia? So just one point that I think is super important that this person is bringing up here.
Yeah.
Yes, some projects have been done. The biggest issue that we have in the state government, aside of the funding, is that the investment tends to go to consultants rather than actually the community. So I want to actually think a little bit, how do we actually create the spaces for communities to have the input, to be able to be part of the process, rather than most of the time investing in consultants rather than the community. And that's something to look into it as we're talking about future mayor coming up.
Great. Just a few minutes left. I want to make good on my word that if any of the panelists have questions for each other or something that they particularly want to respond to that they appreciated that they heard, I sometimes get frustrated when I talk on panels like that. I want to ask them a question. So I don't know if any of you have sort of final thoughts, but also responding to each other or asking each other any questions in our last 3 minutes here. Don't let me down now, folks.
I'll ask a broader question for the panel. Anyone can answer, which is like, I live in the Washington, D.C. area. As I said, I've done a lot of work in New York, but how aligned are the people who live in that corridor now on the actual goals of any project with FDR right now? But is there goal alignment, so to speak?
If you're talking about the entirety of the FDR, you just there certainly is not going to be shared alignment. There are going to be different priorities based on the area, and the topography just looks and feels different throughout. I think there is, especially post Superstorm Sandy, people are concerned about the next storm, and does it mean that they're going to lose electricity to their building? Does it mean they're going to, be flooded out, and some of these other concerns? And at the same time, I think people want, more space. They want, places where they can play baseball, or their, kids can play soccer, but don't want to lose access to the waterfront, one of the things that Ali was talking about earlier. And so how do we sort of mesh all these things together? And so it's safety, it's recreation, it's employment, certainly as Maritza was talking about, but all from different angles. And so it's just sort of this big ball of things that have to come together and be sorted out. Pretty complex, but Tyler, we're hoping with Cavnew, you can just put the the Cav lane into the FDR, and we're all going to be taking
2 weeks. Just give us 2 weeks, and we're good.
2 weeks.
But can you do a self-charging lane? That's my question. Can you do an
eventually?
Yeah, we need one lane where we can incentivize people traveling on the FDR to migrate to all electric technology. It's sort of like an incentive, right? Like if you do it, you get a
Free pass.
sort of a carpool lane sort of benefit, but you're an EV, and that's one way to convince people to migrate on that technology.
I love it. Hey, I just want to give Matt a moment to close us out here. I just want to thank everyone. Great conversation. Over to you, Matt, for the last word.
Thank you, Venetia, and thanks, panelists. It's never enough time to talk about such a deep topic, so we appreciate you all engaging. And I just want to say to the audience members, the students, those who joined us, this is the beginning of a conversation. We're going to be continuing to work on this all day today, and also we'll be generating a report of what occurred today over the whole day, as well as following up with a TAP report in the fall. So I put my email in the chat. Would be glad to hear from any of you with suggestions of other people we should engage. We are working with NYCHA representatives now to get more of those in the conversation. And I just want to thank again the panelists, as well as ULI New York, the Waterfront Alliance, and everyone who has participated all day today. So we'll see you soon. And there will be a recording of this available on the NYU Shack YouTube channel. Thanks, everybody.